By supper, every mouth in Rosehill would regret the word it used on Eleanor Parker that morning. The church bell had barely stopped ringing when the town began gathering on the front steps, not for prayer, but for judgment. Sunday sunlight lay bright across the whitewashed railing, the hitching posts, the wagon ruts, and the women's bonnets bobbing together like pale flowers in a wind that carried whispers instead of mercy. Nell stood at the bottom of the steps with her reticule clutched in both hands, trying to keep her shoulders straight while the word moved around her again and again. Ruined. It did not matter that she had spent the storm night carrying medicine to Mrs. Abigail Reed 3 miles beyond the creek. It did not matter that the bridge had washed out before she could return, or that she had sheltered alone in the old stage station until dawn because the road home was gone beneath brown water. By the time she walked back into Rosehill with mud on her hem and rain dried stiff in her honey-brown hair, Horace Bell had already found the story he preferred. Now he stood near the church gate in his gray Sunday coat, one hand resting on his polished cane, his face arranged into sorrow so fine it nearly passed for kindness. Beside him, Prudence Vale lifted her chin as if virtue itself had appointed her judge. "The sewing circle cannot accept you, Miss Parker," Prudence said, loud enough for the women behind her to hear and soft enough to pretend regret. "We must consider the example set for decent girls." Nell's fingers tightened around the reticule until the clasp pressed into her palm. She was 24, white, chubby, and soft-faced, wearing the blue calico dress she had sewn from the last good bolt in her mother's shop. Her cheeks burned, but she did not cry. Tears would only give them another thing to interpret. "I helped Mrs. Reed," she said. Her voice sounded smaller than it had in her head. "She was ill. I took medicine and read a paper she could not understand." Horace sighed. "No one questions that you began with good intentions." The words were smooth, poisonous in their politeness. "But a young woman's reputation is a delicate thing. Rose Hill cannot pretend it did not see you return at dawn from the West Road." A murmur passed through the crowd. Nell searched the faces for one person willing to ask what truly happened, but curiosity had already lost to comfort. They preferred a ruined woman to an inconvenient truth. If Nell was ruined, no one had to wonder why Horace had been so eager to buy her mother's dress shop. No one had to ask why Mrs. Reed's debt notice bore numbers that did not match the receipt hidden inside Nell's reticule. Prudence stepped down one stair. "You should withdraw quietly, child. It will spare everyone further embarrassment." Embarrassment. As if the town had not stripped her name in public and asked her to thank them for the modesty of the knife. Nell drew one breath, then another, but before she could answer, the murmuring stopped. A horse shifted near the road. Footsteps crossed the churchyard dust. Daniel Whitmore walked through the crowd with his black Stetson in one hand, his dark coat still marked by trail dust, his weathered face calm in a way that made men move aside without being told. He stopped beside Nell, not touching her, not speaking over her, only standing where every eye had to include him if it looked at her. Then he turned. The words did not fall on Rosehill like romance. They fell like a door slamming shut on cruelty. The churchyard went silent so quickly Nell could hear the leather creak in Daniel Whitmore's glove as he held his hat against his chest. Prudence Vale's mouth opened, then closed again, her certainty suddenly without a place to stand. Horace Bell's polished sorrow thinned into something sharper before he recovered it. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, letting a soft laugh brush the edge of his voice, "surely you do not mean to tie one of the largest ranch names in this county to a matter so unfortunate." Daniel looked at him. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. A woman's name is not a matter. Horace's fingers tightened around his cane. "You cannot repair reputation by making a spectacle of yourself." "No," Daniel said. "But I can make it costly for cowards to keep using hers for sport." Several men looked down at the dust. A few. Women shifted their hymnals from one hand to the other. Nell stood frozen beside him, heat rising under her collar, anger and humiliation tangled so tightly she could not separate them. Part of her wanted to be grateful. Another part wanted to strike the word wife from the air before it settled over her like another decision made by someone else. She had spent all morning being named by other people. Ruined. Unfit. Shameful. Now Daniel, with his wealth, his ranch, his calm gray eyes, had placed another name before the crowd. Wife. It might have been kinder, but it was still a name she had not chosen. Prudence found her voice again. This is rash, Mr. Whitmore. A marriage spoken in anger is hardly decent. Daniel turned his hat once in his hands. Decency would have been asking Miss Parker the truth before condemning her on the church steps. Nell's breath caught at the sound of her own name, spoken plainly, not lowered into pity. Horace stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound reasonable while keeping the crowd close enough to hear. If you insist on this, people will wonder what interest you had in defending her so quickly. Daniel's expression did not change. Let them wonder about me instead. That was when Nell moved. She took 2 steps away from him, not because she rejected the protection, but because she needed air that did not belong to the town. Mr. Whitmore, she said, and her voice shook only once, I would like to leave this churchyard. Daniel stepped back immediately, clearing the path. Yes, ma'am. He did not offer his arm until she looked at it. She did not take it. They walked side by side through the crowd, with every whisper trapped behind teeth. When they reached the road beside the cottonwoods, Nell stopped so suddenly that dust lifted around her shoes. You had no right. Daniel faced her, hat still in hand. I know. The answer struck harder than any defense would have. She had expected argument, explanation, masculine certainty. Instead, he gave her admission. Her fingers closed around the reticule. You said wife before all of them. I did. As if I were yours to answer for. No, his voice remained quiet, but something in it went firm. As if their word ruined needed a stronger word standing against it. Nell looked back toward the church, where faces still watched from beneath bonnet brims and hat shadows. And if I do not want your word either, then you do not keep it. She searched his face for the catch. You cannot unsay it now. No. But I can make sure it never becomes a chain. The wind moved through the cottonwood leaves. Nell heard a wagon wheel somewhere on Main Street, the distant bark of a dog, the mutter of a town disappointed that its entertainment had walked away. Daniel lowered his voice further. I gave them my name as a shield. You decide whether it ever becomes a vow. Nell wanted to distrust that sentence. She wanted to call it pretty and foolish and too late. But he stood 3 feet away, not reaching for her, not demanding gratitude, not looking injured because she was angry. That distance made the ground beneath her feel less tilted. I cannot go back to the dress shop alone, she said at last. The words cost her. Her mother's shop stood on Main Street with blue curtains, a cutting table, and the last things Nell had left of a woman who taught her to sew straight seams and keep straight accounts. But Horace would be waiting there by afternoon with sympathy in one hand and an offer to buy in the other. Daniel nodded once. My Aunt Clara lives 2 streets over from the Mercantile. Widow, respectable, sharper than a branding iron. She has an empty room and a low opinion of gossip. Nell almost smiled, but it did not reach her mouth. You will not take me to your ranch? Not unless you ask. And you will not tell people I agreed to marry you? Not unless you do. She looked down at her reticule. Inside, folded beside a handkerchief, lay Mrs. Reed's receipt, damp at one corner from the storm. The number written there matched the first line on the debt notice Horace had shown the widow, except the total had grown by nearly $40 in a hand that was not Mrs. Reed's. Nell had not understood the danger yesterday. Now she did. Horace had not used the rumor because he believed it. He had used it because a woman called ruined could tell the truth and still not be heard. Take me to your aunt, Nell said. Please. Daniel placed his hat back on his head and turned toward town, walking beside her with the same careful space between them. Behind them, the church bell rope swayed in the open door, silent now, while Rosehill watched the woman it had tried to shame leave with her name not restored, not yet, but defended. Aunt Clara Whitmore opened her front door before Daniel knocked, as if the whole town's shame had reached her parlor ahead of them. She was a narrow woman in a black dress with silver hair pinned high, spectacles hanging from a chain, and eyes sharp enough to make gossip confess before supper. She looked at Daniel first, then at Nell, then past them toward the church road where curious faces had already begun inventing new versions of the morning. Well, Aunt Clara said, if Rose Hill has finished mistaking cruelty for Christian concern, bring the girl inside before the flies hear the story too. Nell stepped into a house that smelled of lemon polish, wool rugs, and soup simmering somewhere beyond the hall. The front room was orderly without being cold, with lace curtains, a small piano, framed photographs, and a sewing basket so neat that every spool seemed to have a moral opinion. Aunt Clara took Nell's reticule only after Nell offered it, then set it on the table within reach. You will have the back bedroom. It locks from the inside. I have dry towels, clean sheets, and no patience for anyone who knocks without permission. Daniel remained in the doorway, hat in hand. He did not cross the threshold until Aunt Clara raised one eyebrow at him. You, Daniel, will take supper in the kitchen and sleep at the bunkhouse if you intend to keep the town from making tomorrow worse than today. Yes, ma'am, he said. Nell looked at him quickly. You are leaving? After I speak with Aunt Clara and make sure you need nothing. I did not ask you to leave. No, Daniel said. But I am making certain no one can say you did not have proper protection under this roof. The word protection sounded different here. At church, it had felt like a crowd pushing her toward a shape she did not choose. In Aunt Clara's hall, it sounded like walls, witness, and a door that shut from her side. She followed Aunt Clara to the back bedroom, a small square room with a quilt folded at the foot of the bed, a washstand, an oil lamp, and a window facing a narrow garden where bean vines climbed a trellis. Aunt Clara placed a brass key on the dresser. This is yours while you are here. Nell touched it with 2 fingers. I cannot pay much. Then do not insult my hospitality by pricing it before you have taken off your bonnet. The older woman's voice was brisk, but not unkind. There is soup when you are ready. If you cry, do it into the towel, not the pillow. Pillows take longer to dry. That almost broke Nell more than tenderness would have. She waited until the door closed, then sat on the edge of the bed with her reticule in her lap. The receipt from Mrs. Reed was still inside, folded around the debt notice Nell had copied by lamplight the night before the storm. She had gone to Mrs. Reed's cabin because the widow could not read the notice Horace Bell had sent, a notice claiming late charges, processing fees, and a final demand so high it would force Mrs. Reed to sell a strip of land behind her house. Nell had noticed one number repeated strangely, then another figure overwritten in a darker hand. She had promised to compare it with the original receipt in town. Then the rain came, the creek rose, and by dawn Horace had turned a washed-out bridge into a ruined reputation. A soft knock sounded at the door. Miss Parker, Daniel called from the hall, I am leaving a note under the door. No need to answer. Paper slid across the floor and stopped near her boot. Nell waited until his footsteps moved away before picking it up. The note was short, written in a plain hand. If you want to leave Rose Hill, I will pay stage fare. If you want a lawyer, I will bring one. If you want silence, I will guard that too. Nothing written at church binds you to me. Nell read the last sentence twice. Her chest ached around it. No man in Rose Hill had asked what she wanted that morning. They had only decided what she was. Daniel's note did not erase his public words, but it placed a door beside them. She could refuse. She could fight. She could run. The choice frightened her because it was real. That evening, after soup and Aunt Clara's sharp comments about weak tea and weaker morals, Nell sat at the little desk in the bedroom and unfolded Mrs. Reed's receipt again. The number at the top matched the first line of Horace's debt notice. The total at the bottom did not. Worse, the second figure had been written in ink with a slightly bluer cast, the same shade Horace used in the town council records Nell had once mended after water damage at the Mercantile. She drew the candle closer. Another line caught her eye, parcel access adjustment. Her breath caught. Behind her mother's dress shop ran the narrow alley that led toward the old freight road, the same road surveyors had measured 3 months ago for a possible route to the new depot. Horace had offered to buy the shop twice after that. Nell had thought he wanted the building because gossip made her weak. Now she wondered if he had made her weak because he wanted the building. The next morning, Aunt Clara delivered coffee and a message. Daniel had sent for a lawyer from San Antonio, and Horace Bell had already called at the dress shop asking whether Miss Parker intended to sell before her circumstances worsened. Nell stood so quickly the chair scraped behind her. The shame in her stomach did not vanish, but it changed direction. "Tell Mr. Whitmore," she said, folding the receipt with careful hands, "that I do not want silence." By mid-morning, Aunt Clara had turned her back parlor into a sewing room, not with softness, but with purpose. She carried in a cutting board, 2 baskets of ranch shirts, 3 folded bolts of cotton, and a ledger with a cracked brown cover, then set them before Nell as if placing weapons on a table. "Idle hands invite other people's opinions," Aunt Clara said. "Busy hands make accounts." Nell understood. If Rose Hill expected her to hide behind curtains until shame softened her into obedience, it would be disappointed. She tied on a clean apron, pinned her sleeves back, and laid Daniel's ranch shirts across the table one by one. Each needed honest work, torn cuffs, pulled seams, buttons missing from hard use. Daniel arrived near noon with a canvas bundle under one arm and dust on his boots, stopping at the parlor threshold as though the room belonged to Nell now. "Aunt Clara said you needed more thread." "Aunt Clara says many things before breakfast," Nell replied without looking up, though her fingers paused over a sleeve. Daniel placed the bundle on a chair, not the table, waiting for permission. "These are from the South Pasture crew. I wrote down each man's name and what needs mending. Wages are at the top." Nell's needle stilled. "You do not need to pay me for charity disguised as work. I do not give charity to skilled labor and call it kindness." His voice was matter-of-fact, almost too plain to argue with. Nell looked at the ledger he had brought. Beside each shirt was a name, a repair, and a price. 6 cents for a cuff, 4 cents for a button row, 12 cents for a torn shoulder seam. Nothing lavish. Nothing pitying. Work priced as work. Something inside her loosened in a way that frightened her more than anger had. She wrote the first entry in Aunt Clara's ledger with a steady hand. "Whitmore Ranch, mending received." All afternoon, Nell measured fabric, matched thread, and forced her thoughts to move in straight lines. When her mind drifted toward the church steps, she looked instead at numbers. Mrs. Reed's receipt. Horace's debt notice. The route map Daniel had found at the county clerk's office and brought back folded into his coat pocket. The map was old, but the pencil marks were new, tracing a possible freight path from the west road past the Reed parcel, behind Nell's dress shop, and onward toward the planned depot site. Her mother's narrow alley, the one where rain barrels stood against the brick wall, would become access if the route was approved. Access meant value. Value meant Horace had not been offering mercy when he asked to buy the shop. He had been circling it like a hawk over a field mouse. Near sundown, Daniel returned with Mr. Elias Pritchard, a lawyer from San Antonio who wore a dusty black coat and carried a leather satchel heavy with papers. Aunt Clara gave him tea strong enough to warn him against foolishness, then led everyone to the dining table. Nell sat with her receipt, the copied debt notice, and the route map arranged before her. Daniel stood by the mantel until Aunt Clara pointed at a chair. "Sit, Daniel. Looming is not legal assistance." He sat. Nell almost smiled. Mr. Pritchard examined the papers with a magnifying glass, his brows drawing closer with each line. He asked Nell when she had copied the notice, whether Mrs. Reed had signed anything that night, whether Horace had known she was carrying the receipt back to town. Nell answered carefully. Her voice did not tremble. The lawyer compared the figures, then tapped the page with one finger. This total was altered after the first sum was written. The pressure is different. The ink is different. And this fee, parcel access adjustment, does not belong on a widow's household debt unless someone hoped to confuse land access with arrears. Aunt Clara muttered something about bankers and buzzards. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Nell looked at the map until the lines blurred. So he lied about me because I saw the paper. Mr. Pritchard removed his spectacles. I cannot yet prove he began the rumor, Miss Parker. But I can prove the debt notice deserves examination, and I can request the original records. Nell folded her hands in her lap to hide how cold they had gone. Proof was not the same as safety. Horace still had the town's ear. Prudence still had the church ladies. A woman could have evidence in both hands and still be dismissed if people preferred the comfort of her disgrace. Daniel seemed to read the thought, but he did not answer for her. Instead, he slid a small envelope across the table. Payment for today's mending. Aunt Clara witnessed the count. Nell stared at it. This is not necessary tonight. It is necessary because you earned it today. She opened the envelope. Coins rested inside, simple and solid. Not rescue. Not pity. Wages. Her throat tightened, but she counted them aloud, then wrote the sum in the ledger. That act, more than Daniel's words on the church steps, made her feel the first thin edge of ground beneath her feet. When Mr. Pritchard left to file inquiries at the county office, twilight had settled blue against the windows. Daniel remained on the porch, speaking with Aunt Clara in low tones, while Nell stayed at the table with the receipt and map. A knock came at the front door, sharp and confident. Aunt Clara opened it only halfway. Horace Bell's voice slid through the gap, polished as ever. I have come with an offer for Miss Parker's shop. Given her present difficulties, she may find it wise to consider a quick sale. Nell rose before Daniel could move. The coins in her envelope pressed against her palm like a reminder. She was not ruined. She was not helpless. And Horace Bell had just confirmed exactly what he wanted. Horace Bell stood on Aunt Clara's porch with his hat in one hand and an envelope in the other, wearing the expression of a man who believed a woman's fear could be priced by the square foot. Miss Parker, he said when Nell came to the door, I do not wish to trouble you after such a difficult morning, but practical matters often become kinder when handled quickly. Your mother's shop will be hard for you to keep now. Customers may hesitate. Credit may tighten. A clean sale would spare you further embarrassment. He held out the envelope. Nell looked at it, then at his smooth face. The old shame tried to rise, but the weight of the coins she had earned that day still pressed against her palm, and the receipt lay on Aunt Clara's dining table behind her like a quiet witness. You came to offer kindness at sundown, she asked. I came to prevent ruin from spreading. Daniel stood in the hallway, one shoulder near the wall, his hands still, his jaw set. Nell felt him there, but he did not step in front of her. He had learned already that saving her meant leaving room for her voice. Horace glanced past her toward him. Mr. Whitmore's grand statement does not change the way towns work, Miss Parker. A name may be lent in public and withdrawn in private. Property, however, can be settled in writing. Nell took the envelope at last. Horace almost smiled. Then she tore it open, unfolded the paper, and read the amount. It was less than half the shop's worth before the route survey, and barely a third of what the building would bring once the depot road was approved. She folded it again with slow care. My mother taught me hems, figures, and men who call theft mercy, she said. Your offer is declined. Horace's eyes cooled. You may not receive another. Then I will have one less insult to answer. Aunt Clara made a pleased sound behind her. Daniel lowered his gaze, not hiding amusement, only keeping it private. Horace placed his hat back on his head. Pride is expensive, Miss Parker. So is fraud, Nell said, and for the first time, Horace had nothing polished ready. He left without another word, his boots sharp on the porch boards. That night, Aunt Clara insisted Nell move to Whitmore Ranch for a few days while Mr. Pritchard gathered documents, not to hide her, but because Horace had stopped pretending. Aunt Clara rode with her in the covered wagon the next morning, sitting straight as a church steeple, while Daniel drove with a silence that made space for Nell to watch the town pass by. Rose Hill looked ordinary in daylight, mercantile windows, hitching rails, laundry, children chasing a hoop near the road. Yet every doorway seemed to remember what had been said. At the ranch, the house stood broad and sun-warmed beneath live oaks, with barns beyond and pastures stretching toward a low blue line of hills. Daniel did not carry Nell's valise inside until she handed it to him. Aunt Clara chose the east guest room, inspected the lock, then declared the household barely civilized but serviceable. By afternoon, Nell had a sewing table near a window overlooking the yard. Ranch hands brought shirts and coats with shy respect. No one whispered. No one lowered her name. They called her Miss Parker, And each time they did, something bruised inside her eased by a fraction. Days began to take shape. Coffee appeared outside the sewing room door in the morning, always set down and left before she opened it. A loose leg on the sewing table was repaired while she walked with Aunt Clara after supper. A crate of fabric scraps arrived from the mercantile with a receipt paid in full by Whitmore Ranch, though Daniel wrote a note saying the cost would be deducted only if she chose to accept the work. He never mentioned the churchyard. He never repeated the word wife. That restraint did more to trouble Nell's heart than any courtship speech could have done. On the third evening, she found him on the back porch mending a bridle by lamplight. "Why did you do it?" she asked. "At the church." His hands paused. For a long moment, only crickets answered from the grass. "My mother was called shameful when I was 16, he said. No one proved a thing. No one needed to. The word was enough. My father had land, cattle, and a voice men listened to, but he kept quiet because he thought the storm would pass if he did not feed it." Daniel drew the leather strap through his fingers. It did not pass. It settled into her bones. Nell stood very still. "Is that why you spoke for me?" He looked up then, gray eyes steady and sad. "It is why I spoke against them. Not for you. I am learning the difference." The answer found a place in her that had been guarded since Sunday morning. Before she could reply, a ranch hand rode in fast from the front road, pulling his horse to a stop near the porch. "Mr. Whitmore," he called, "Horace Bell is coming up the drive. Mrs. Vale is with him, and they brought a paper for Miss Parker to sign." Daniel set the bridle aside and stood, but Nell stepped past him toward the front of the house, her hands cold, her spine straight. Behind her, Aunt Clara opened the door with the receipt, the route map, and the debt notice already gathered in her arms. Horace Bell arrived at Whitmore Ranch in a black buggy that looked too polished for the ranch road, with Prudence Vale seated beside him as stiff as a church window and twice as cold. Dust followed them up the drive and settled over the porch steps where Nell stood with Aunt Clara on one side and Daniel on the other. The late sun caught the edge of the papers in Aunt Clara's arms, Mrs. Reed's receipt, the copy debt notice, the route map, and Horace's insult of an offer folded neatly on top. Daniel had put on his black Stetson, but his hands remained at his sides. He did not stand in front of Nell. He stood close enough that the world would have to notice she was not alone, and far enough that every word she spoke would be hers. Horace climbed down with a careful smile. "Miss Parker, I had hoped we could settle this privately before embarrassment hardens into consequence." Prudence stepped from the buggy with a small leather folder pressed to her chest. "The women of Rose Hill have been patient," she said. "But patience cannot protect a community from scandal." Nell felt the old flesh climb her throat, but she held her place. The porch boards were solid beneath her feet. Behind her was a locked room, honest wages, a sewing table, a lawyer's questions, and Daniel's quiet promise that nothing bound her except her own choice. "What paper did you bring?" she asked. Horace produced a document and held it out. "A transfer agreement for your shop. A fair price, considering the present damage to its reputation. Sign today, and I will make certain conversations fade from public memory." Aunt Clara gave a dry laugh. "Mercy with a purchase price. How original." Horace ignored her. "Mr. Whitmore has made this unpleasant situation theatrical. I am offering practical relief." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Prudence opened her folder. "And I have prepared a statement for the church committee. If Miss Parker leaves town quietly and avoids further public argument, we may refrain from formal censure." Nell turned toward her. "Formal censure for what?" Prudence's eyes flicked to Horace, then back. "For conduct unbecoming a respectable young woman." "You have proof of such conduct?" Prudence's gloved fingers tightened on the folder. "There are appearances." "Appearances are not proof." Nell's voice came clearer than she expected. Horace's smile faded by a fraction. "Miss Parker, this defiance will not help you. A woman in your position should welcome a path that preserves what little peace remains." Nell took one step toward the porch table, and Aunt Clara laid the papers down before her. The receipt first, then the debt notice, then the route map, then Horace's offer. The ranch yard had gone quiet. Two hands near the barn stopped loading feed. A boy holding a water bucket stood still, watching. Nell placed her palm on Mrs. Reed's receipt. This is why I was on the West Road that night. Mrs. Reed was ill, and I took medicine to her cabin. I also helped her read a debt paper you sent. Horace's cane tip pressed into the dirt. A charitable errand does not explain a ruined reputation. Daniel's head turned slowly toward him, but Nell spoke first. No. Your lie explains that. Prudence gasped. Horace's eyes hardened. Nell slid the copied debt notice forward. This paper demands charges Mrs. Reed never agreed to pay. The total was altered in different ink. Mr. Pritchard says the original records should be examined. A lawyer hired by Whitmore money, Horace said. Then let the county examine it, Nell replied. She unfolded the route map and weighted the corners with 2 smooth stones from the porch rail. This old freight path runs behind Mrs. Reed's parcel, past my mother's dress shop, and toward the new depot survey. You tried to buy my shop twice after the surveyors came. When I saw Mrs. Reed's paper, you needed the town to stop listening to me. Her hands trembled, so she pressed them flat against the table. If I am the ruined one, why are all your papers trying to take what my mother left me? The question moved through the yard more sharply than any shout. Prudence looked at the map as though she had never considered that gossip could have a ledger behind it. Horace recovered, but not cleanly. You are confused and emotional. No, Nell said. I am finally adding the figures. Daniel's mouth softened for the first time all day. Horace turned toward him. Control this, Whitmore. You began this farce when you spoke at the church. Daniel stepped forward only 1 pace. She is not mine to control. Horace flushed. You claimed otherwise before half the town. I gave my name to shield her from yours. That is not the same thing. The buggy horse shifted, harness jingling in the silence. From the road came another rider, this one wearing a county badge. Sheriff Amos Klein reined in near the gate, his gaze moving from the documents to Horace's rigid face. Aunt Clara had sent a ranch hand for him the moment the buggy appeared, and her satisfaction showed in the lift of one eyebrow. Sheriff Klein dismounted. Mr. Bell, Mrs. Vale, Miss Parker, looks like this has outgrown porch talk. Horace straightened. Sheriff, I object to being summoned over domestic drama. The sheriff took the debt notice and studied the altered lines. This looks less like drama and more like county business. He turned to Nell. Miss Parker, bring every paper you have to town hall tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Mr. Pritchard too, if he has returned. Mrs. Reed will be asked to testify. Nell's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. Tomorrow meant the same town that had named her would hear her speak. Tomorrow meant Prudence, Horace, church eyes, mercantile whispers, and every silence that had stood against her. Daniel looked at her, not with command, but with the steady question he always gave instead of pressure. Nell lifted Mrs. Reed's receipt from the table and held it against her chest. I will be there, she said, and for the first time since Sunday, Horace Bell looked as if he believed her. Town hall smelled of pine boards, lamp oil, and too many people pretending they had come only for justice. By 10 o'clock, every bench was full. Men stood along the back wall with hats in their hands. Women gathered in tight rows beneath the tall windows, their Sunday gloves folded over hymn books that had no business at a county hearing. Nell entered with Aunt Clara on one side and Mr. Pritchard on the other, carrying Mrs. Reed's receipt, the copy debt notice, the route map, and Horace Bell's purchase offer in a flat leather folder against her chest. Daniel followed several steps behind, close enough for the room to know he stood with her, far enough for no one to mistake his strength for her voice. Nell felt every gaze turn. The old word did not need to be spoken. It moved across the benches in the way mouths tightened and eyes dropped too late. Sheriff Klein stood near the front table, where a county clerk had arranged ink, blank paper, and a Bible for sworn statements. Horace Bell sat to the right in his gray coat, his cane across his knees, looking less like an accused man than a banker inconvenienced by dust. Prudence Vale sat behind him, posture rigid, face pale with the effort of appearing righteous. Mrs. Abigail Reed had been brought in by wagon from the West Road, wrapped in a brown shawl, her thin hands resting on a small packet of papers. When she saw Nell, she nodded once, and that single nod steadied Nell more than a dozen comforting speeches could have done. Sheriff Klein cleared his throat. This hearing concerns questions about a debt notice issued to Mrs. Reed, a purchase offer made to Miss Parker, and statements affecting Miss Parker's reputation after the storm 3 nights ago. We will speak one at a time, and we will speak plain. Plain was all Nell wanted. Mr. Pritchard began with the papers. He showed the receipt first, dated and signed before the storm. Mrs. Reed confirmed Nell had arrived at her cabin before dark with medicine, had read the debt notice aloud, and had stayed until the rain grew so heavy the creek road became unsafe. She left when she thought there was still light enough, Mrs. Reed said, her voice thin but steady. If the bridge had held, she would have been home before supper. The room shifted. Someone coughed. Nell kept her eyes on the table. Then Mr. Pritchard held up the debt notice. The amount demanded here does not match Mrs. Reed's receipt. 2 figures were altered in a different hand. A charge labeled parcel access adjustment appears where no such fee belongs. He placed the route map beside it. The proposed freight path passes behind Mrs. Reed's land and behind Miss Parker's dress shop. The value of both properties changes if this route is approved. Horace laughed softly. Speculation. A map proves nothing but geography. Mr. Pritchard did not blink. Then perhaps your offer to purchase Miss Parker's shop at less than half its assessed value, delivered after your public remarks damaged her business, will prove intent. He laid the offer on the table. A murmur rose, then fell when Sheriff Klein lifted his hand. Prudence leaned forward. Mr. Bell did not create the concern about Miss Parker. The concern arose naturally from appearances. Nell looked at her then. Naturally? Prudence's mouth tightened. A young woman returned at dawn after a night away from town. Respectable people were bound to question it. Questioning would have included a question, Nell said. Her voice carried farther than she expected. No one asked me where I had been. No one asked Mrs. Reed whether I reached her cabin. No one asked about the bridge. You heard a story that made me smaller, and you chose to repeat it because it made you feel larger. Prudence's eyes flickered. Daniel stood at the back of the room, his hat held low, his face still. He did not smile, but the pride in his silence reached Nell across the benches. Sheriff Klein turned to Horace. Who first told you Miss Parker returned from the West Road at dawn? Horace's answer came too quickly. Several people saw her. Names. I cannot be expected to remember every passerby. Then tell us why you visited her shop twice after the depot survey and again after the church gathering. Horace's face hardened. Because I believed a sale would be practical for a woman whose prospects had changed. Mrs. Reed lifted her head. You told me the same about my land. Said sickness made poor managers of widows. The room stirred again. Horace stood, irritation breaking through polish. This is nonsense. A sick widow and a compromised seamstress cannot overturn every business matter in Rose Hill because Whitmore Money hired a lawyer. The word compromised landed with a dull thud. Nell rose slowly. Her knees trembled beneath her skirt, but she did not sit back down. Say what you mean, Mr. Bell. His eyes flashed. Everyone knows what you were called. Say who made them call me that. Silence stretched. Horace looked toward Prudence, toward the benches, toward the clerk's ink bottle, anywhere but at Nell. No one would have listened to her once she was ruined, he snapped. The sentence left his mouth before caution could catch it. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Sheriff Klein leaned forward, very still. Once she was ruined, he repeated. Not once she had done wrong. Horace's face lost color. Nell pressed one hand to the folder, feeling the edges of every paper inside it, every fact they had tried to bury beneath a name. At the back of the hall, Daniel lowered his eyes, not in defeat, but in quiet thanks that the truth had finally found its own voice. The room did not erupt after Horace's mistake. It emptied of sound instead, as if every person in town hall had drawn one breath and forgotten how to release it. Nell stood at the front table with Mrs. Reed's receipt in one hand and her own name hanging in the air, no longer dragged through dust, but returned to her like something found under floorboards after a long, dishonest winter. Sheriff Klein looked at Horace Bell for several seconds, then turned to the clerk. Write that down exactly. The clerk dipped his pen, his hand moving quickly over the page. Horace sat down too fast, cane knocking against the bench. I misspoke. You spoke plain, Aunt Clara said from the first row. Prudence Vale's face had gone almost gray beneath the brim of her bonnet. She kept her eyes on her gloves, but Sheriff Klein was not finished with her. Mrs. Vale, did you have any direct proof of improper conduct by Miss Parker before you spoke against her at the church? Prudence swallowed. The circumstances were troubling. That was not my question. The sheriff waited. The whole room waited with him. At last, Prudence's voice thinned. No, I had no direct proof. Nell closed her eyes for 1 second. The answer did not heal the mourning on the church steps. It did not pull back the whispers or repair the customers who had crossed the street rather than pass her shop. But it placed truth where rumor had stood, and truth, even late, had weight. Mr. Pritchard gathered the papers into a neat stack. Sheriff, with Mrs. Reed's sworn statement, Mr. Bell's inconsistent debt notice, his below-value purchase offer, and his own words, I request that the original county records be secured immediately. Sheriff Klein nodded to the deputy near the door. Ride to the records office. Tell them no file connected to Mrs. Reed's parcel or Miss Parker's shop leaves the shelf without my written order. Horace rose again, color returning in an angry flush. You cannot treat me as a criminal because a seamstress dislikes a business offer. Daniel moved for the first time since the hearing began, not toward Horace, but toward the center aisle where everyone could see him. He held his hat in both hands, his voice calm enough that the room leaned toward it. A business offer does not need a woman shamed before a church to make it work. Horace snapped, this does not concern you. It concerned me the moment this town decided her name could be broken in public and mended in private. Nell looked at Daniel then. He did not look back as if seeking praise. His gaze stayed on the room, asking it to do what it had refused to do before, witness her fully. Sheriff Klein stepped between the tables. Mr. Bell, until the records are reviewed, you will remain available for questioning. You will surrender any copies of the Reed debt notice, the purchase offer, and related correspondence to my office before sundown. Horace's mouth tightened. And if I refuse? Then I will have the county judge explain it with more paper than patience. A nervous laugh moved through the back benches and died quickly. Nell set the receipt down. Her hands had finally stopped shaking. She turned toward Prudence first, because it was Prudence who had wrapped cruelty in respectability, who had made judgment sound like duty. You called me ruined because it gave you permission not to ask. The words came steady, each one placed where the town could not step around it. You did not know the truth. You knew only that a woman standing alone was easier to condemn than a man with a good coat and a bank ledger. Prudence's lips parted, but no answer came. Nell turned then to the benches, to the shopkeepers, wives, ranch hands, clerks, and church members who had carried the word from mouth to mouth until it seemed larger than fact. My name is Eleanor Parker. I went to help a sick widow. I was caught by a washout bridge. I slept under a leaking stage station roof because the road home was underwater. That is all. If shame belongs anywhere in this room, it belongs to those who needed less than that to bury me. Somewhere in the back, a woman began to cry quietly. Nell did not look for her. She had spent too many days measuring herself by other people's faces. Sheriff Klein cleared the hearing until the next morning, when the county records could be reviewed under seal. People rose slowly, awkward in the presence of the woman they had misnamed. Some avoided her eyes. A few tried to approach, but Aunt Clara's stare turned them aside. Outside, the afternoon sun struck Nell so brightly she had to blink. The town looked the same as it had before the hearing, but it no longer felt like a place holding its boot on her throat. Daniel came down the steps last. He did not touch her. He simply held out 3 things in his gloved hand: the deed copy to her dress shop, an envelope containing every coin she had earned for ranch mending, and a stage ticket west to San Antonio. Before tomorrow changes anything, he said, I want this clear. Your shop is yours. Your wages are yours. Your road is yours. If you leave Rose Hill tonight, I will have a driver take you. If you stay, I will stand where you ask me to stand. If you never speak to me again after what I said at the church, I will still say you deserved better than they gave you." Nell looked at the ticket, then at the town hall door where Horace Bell was being questioned under Sheriff Klein. By the next afternoon, Rose Hill had no rumor left large enough to cover the truth. Sheriff Klein returned to town hall with the county clerk, Mr. Pritchard, and 3 sealed record books taken from the land office under written order. The benches filled again, but this time the room carried a different silence. It was not hunger for scandal. It was the discomfort of people realizing they had been eager to believe one lie because believing it cost them nothing. The clerk laid out Mrs. Reed's original debt record first. The numbers were plain, smaller, and signed months earlier. Then he placed Horace Bell's notice beside it, with the altered total and the false parcel access charge written in a darker hand. Mr. Pritchard showed the same ink marks on Horace's private purchase offer for Nell's shop, and then the route survey that proved both properties would rise in value once the depot road was approved. There was no grand speech left for Horace. His respectable coat could not hide the papers. His cane did not make the figures less false. Sheriff Klein read the charges clearly: attempted fraud against Mrs. Abigail Reed, falsified debt records, coercive purchase practice, and the deliberate use of false public statements to damage Eleanor Parker's business standing. Horace tried once to object, but the county clerk held up a page bearing Horace's own initials beside the altered filing copy. That ended him more completely than shouting ever could have done. The sheriff took Horace into custody in front of the same town that had once leaned toward his voice. Men who had nodded with him at the church steps now stepped back. The banker who shared his office keys sent a clerk to remove Bell's name from the lending desk until trial. Mrs. Reed sat with both hands folded around her shawl while Mr. Pritchard confirmed that her debt would return to the original lawful amount, without the false charges, and that no sale or lien could proceed on Horace's papers. Nell's dress shop was confirmed in her mother's name and transferred cleanly to Nell, free from Horace's offer, claim, or pressure. Prudence Vale did not face a sheriff's charge, but consequence found her in a quieter, colder way. The church committee, embarrassed before the whole county, removed her from leadership of the sewing circle until she made public amends. At Sheriff Klein's insistence and under the eyes of the clerk, she wrote a notice to be posted on the church door, the mercantile board, and the window of Nell's dress shop. No evidence supports the statements made against Miss Eleanor Parker. Those statements were false and should not be repeated. Prudence's hand shook as she signed it. Nell watched without triumph. The apology did not return the hours she had spent with shame pressed to her throat, but it made the town look directly at what it had done. That mattered. When the hearing ended, people lingered near the steps, uncertain how to approach a woman they had wronged in public. Nell did not wait for them to arrange their comfort. She walked to the center of the room, holding her deed copy in one hand and the stage ticket Daniel had given her in the other. Daniel stood near the back, hat in hand, not moving closer until she chose where to look. "I am not leaving Rose Hill because Horace Bell wanted me small," Nell said. Her voice was not loud, but the room carried it. "I am not staying because I have nowhere else to go. I have a ticket. I have wages. I have a shop that is mine. I am staying because my mother built that shop with honest hands, because Mrs. Reed deserves a neighbor who asks questions, and because no woman in this town should have to disappear for a lie to feel settled." She turned then to Daniel, and the smallest tremor passed through her fingers before she steadied them. "And if I ever take the name Whitmore, it will not be because you saved me from shame. It will be because you gave me room to stand while I saved my own name." Daniel crossed the room slowly, stopping where everyone could see the space he left between them. He removed his black Stetson, just as he had done on the church steps, but this time the town did not lean forward to judge. It listened. "I did not call her my wife to own her," he said. "I said it because this town needed to hear that her name was worth defending. If she chooses me, I will count that as grace. If she does not, I will still count her honorable. Eleanor Parker belongs to herself before she belongs beside anyone." Nell's eyes filled, but the tears did not fall. She looked at the man who had given her a shield, then stepped back so she could decide whether it became a vow. In front of Rose Hill, She placed the stage ticket into her reticule and took Daniel's hand because she wanted to, not because she had been cornered into gratitude. 6 months later, Horace Bell was convicted on the fraud charges, fined, and barred from holding a lending position in Rose Hill. Mrs. Reed kept her land. The depot road was approved, but not through stolen papers or frightened widows. Prudence Vale spent the winter mending linens for the poor under Aunt Clara's supervision, and no one in town confused gossip with virtue quite so easily again. By spring, Nell's dress shop had blue curtains in the windows, new bolts of calico on the shelves, and a sign in gold letters that read Parker Sewing and Alterations. She hired 2 widows part-time, taught young girls to keep ledgers as carefully as seams, and placed the church notice in a small frame behind the counter, not from bitterness, but as a reminder that names must be handled with care. 1 year after the Sunday that nearly broke her, the lamps in the shop still burned warm after sunset. Nell stood at the cutting table with a simple wedding ring on her hand, laughing softly as Aunt Clara corrected a crooked hem and Mrs. Reed poured coffee from a blue enamel pot. Outside, Daniel Whitmore leaned against the porch post, his black Stetson tipped back, watching lamplight spill across the boardwalk like welcome. A child ran past with a ribbon scrap, horses shifted at the hitching rail, and beyond the rooftops the Texas pasture glowed under the last gold of evening. Nell had once walked that same street with every window judging her. Now the windows shone around her, and the home she had found was not only the ranch, not only the shop, not only the man waiting outside with patient eyes. It was the life she had chosen, the name she had kept, and the door she opened for every woman who came in from the dark needing to be called whole again.